My name is Vivian Hale. The day my boyfriend's mother looked me in the eyes and called me a gold digger, I smiled and said nothing. She thought I owned one pair of decent shoes. She had no idea a Gulfstream registered in my name was already being fueled 40 minutes from her dining room. I want to tell you how I got there. I want to tell you about the year I let a family believe I was nothing and what happened the night the sky finally answered for me. I was 29 years old, sitting at the end of a mahogany table in Greenwich, Connecticut, wearing a thrift store cardigan I'd bought for $11. Listening to a woman named Deborah Whitfield explain to her dinner guests that some people simply weren't raised to understand fine china. She wasn't talking about the china. She was talking about me. I'd been dating her son, Nathaniel, for 14 months by then. He was kind. He worked hard at his family's investment firm, came home tired, complained about his father the way sons do, and looked at me like I was the only steady thing in his life. I believed, for a long time, that this was enough. That love could survive a family who thought I was beneath their son. I was wrong about that. But I didn't know it yet. What none of them knew, what Nathaniel himself didn't fully know, was that I hadn't taken a salary from anyone in 6 years. I hadn't needed to. I was the founder and sole owner of Hale Meridian Group, a holding company with stakes in logistics, biotech real estate, and a fintech platform that had, 3 months earlier, quietly crossed $1 billion in valuation. I ran it from a laptop in coffee shops and from a penthouse on the Upper West Side that none of them had ever seen. I want to explain why, because I know it sounds strange. I know it sounds like a woman playing games with people's feelings. It wasn't a game. It was a promise I'd made to my father in a hospital room 6 years before any of this happened. But I'll get to that. For now, all you need to know is this. I sat at that table in Greenwich, in my $11 cardigan, and let a woman who owned 4 houses tell her friends I probably didn't know what a salad fork was for. I picked up the salad fork. I ate my salad. And I smiled. That dinner wasn't unusual. It was, if anything, one of the gentler ones. There had been the 4th of July barbecue where Nathaniel's father, Richard, asked me in front of 11 people what my household income situation looked like because he wanted to make sure I understood the responsibilities that came with a Whitfield last name. I told him I did freelance consulting. That was true. I consulted for exactly one company. It was mine. There had been the Christmas party where Nathaniel's older sister, Caroline, handed me a shopping bag of her old clothes in case I needed something nicer for family events, then laughed with her husband about it in the kitchen, not realizing I could hear every word through the swinging door. There had been the golf club lunch where a family friend, a woman named Pam who wore a tennis bracelet the size of a bicycle chain, asked me what my 5-year plan was, then turned to Deborah and said, not quietly enough, well, at least she's polite. Some of these girls Nathaniel could have brought home wouldn't even know how to be polite about being poor. I want you to understand something. I could have ended every single one of those conversations in about 4 seconds. I could have said a number that would have made the room go silent. I chose not to. Not because I enjoyed the humiliation. I didn't. There were nights I sat in my car in their driveway, engine running, hands on the wheel, feeling something hot and furious rise in my chest before I made myself breathe it back down. I stayed quiet because I needed to know something else. I needed to know if Nathaniel would ever, on his own, without a bank statement forcing his hand, stand up for me simply because it was right. He almost did, sometimes. At the 4th of July barbecue, when his father pushed too hard, Nathaniel had said, "Dad, that's enough," quietly, and changed the subject. It wasn't nothing. But it wasn't enough either. A quiet, "that's enough," doesn't undo a public humiliation. It just makes the silence afterward more comfortable for everyone except me. I told myself I was being patient. Looking back, I think I was doing something more dangerous. I think I was hoping, against a year of evidence, that the story would end differently than it was clearly telling me it would. I should have listened sooner. But I wasn't ready to give up on him yet. Here's where I have to go back further, because none of what happened later makes sense without it. I grew up in Ohio, in a house that had money and then, very suddenly, didn't. My father built a mid-sized manufacturing company from nothing, and when I was 19, a partner he trusted for over a decade forged his signature on a set of loan guarantees and disappeared with almost everything. The company folded within a year. My father spent the next 4 years fighting lawsuits that were never really about getting the money back. There wasn't any money left to get back. They were about proving, to himself as much as anyone, that he hadn't been a fool. I watched people who had eaten dinner at our table for 15 years stop returning his calls within a month of the company going under. I watched women who once complimented my mother's decorating start whispering about how they'd always suspected something was off with my father's business. Nobody who mattered to us in the good years stayed around for the bad ones. Only 2 people did. My father never forgot that, and neither did I. He got sick when I was 23. Pancreatic cancer, aggressive, fast. I sat with him most nights in that hospital room in Columbus, and somewhere in the 3rd month, when the machines were the loudest thing in the room, he took my hand and made me promise him something. He said, "Vivian, if you ever have anything, money, a name, a position, don't let anyone find out about it before they show you who they really are. People will tell you who they are for free if you let them. Money makes everyone a liar for a while. Poverty is the only thing that tells you the truth fast." I didn't understand it then the way I understand it now. He died 11 weeks later. I inherited almost nothing in dollars. There was almost nothing left, but I inherited his instinct for building something, and I inherited that promise. It took me 4 years, a small business loan I paid back within 18 months, one very lucky logistics contract, and more work than I've ever described to anyone at a dinner party, to build Hale Meridian Group into what it became. By the time I met Nathaniel at a mutual friend's engagement party in Brooklyn, I was already worth more than his entire family, and not one person in his world knew my last name meant anything beyond the quiet girl Nathaniel's dating. I liked it that way. For a while, I thought I needed it that way. I told myself I was testing his family. The truth, the harder truth, is that I was testing myself. I wanted to know if I could stand in a room full of people who thought I was worthless and still believe, privately, that I wasn't. My father's promise had become something bigger than caution. It had become the last conversation I still knew how to have with him. Things started to shift 6 weeks before the engagement party. Nathaniel proposed in April, in Central Park, nervous and sweet, and I said yes because I loved him genuinely, uncomplicatedly, in the part of me that wasn't running a 9-figure company. Deborah took the news of the engagement the way she took most news involving me, with a tight smile and an immediate phone call to plan a party that was, unmistakably, more about showing off to her friends than celebrating us. It was during those 6 weeks that the cracks in my carefulness started to show, even though there was the packages that arrived at my apartment, not Nathaniel's, mine, the one he thought was a modest 1-bedroom sublet in Murray Hill, and not the penthouse it actually was, a watch, a set of documents couriered from Zurich, a birthday gift from a business partner in Singapore that Nathaniel glimpsed once on my wrist before I slid a cardigan sleeve over it and changed the subject. Small things. Threads, really. Nobody pulled hard enough to unravel them. Not yet. I told myself I'd tell him before the wedding. I told myself there was still time to do this the right way, to sit him down privately and explain everything, my father, the promise, the reasons, all of it, before his family ever had to know it all. The engagement party took that choice away from me. The party was held at the Whitfields Country Club in late September, under a white tent strung with lights, 240 guests, an open bar that alone probably cost more than my father's last year of medical bills. I wore a navy dress I'd owned for 3 years. Deborah wore something that had clearly cost more than most people's cars. She'd spent the cocktail hour introducing me to her friends with a version of my biography so thin it barely qualified as one. "This is Vivian, Nathaniel's fiancée. She does something with consulting, Isn't she sweet? Around 9 o'clock, after the toasts, after Richard's speech about legacy and family name that somehow never once used my name, Deborah found me near the dessert table with a glass of champagne in her hand and something harder in her eyes. "I want you to know," she said, low enough that only I could hear it, "that I've made peace with this. Nathaniel could have done better, financially speaking, but I've made peace with it. I just hope you understand what you're marrying into, and that you'll try to grow into it. Some people take longer to learn how to belong in rooms like this." I looked at her for a long moment. "I understand exactly what I'm marrying into," I said. She misheard it as gratitude. She patted my arm and walked away to greet more guests, satisfied, I think, that she'd been generous with me. Caroline found me 20 minutes later, a little drunk, considerably less careful with her words. "Can I be honest?" she said, and didn't wait for an answer. "I don't think you're a bad person. I just think you're not from our world. And I worry Nathaniel doesn't see that yet. He will. Everyone does eventually." A man I didn't recognize, a business partner of Richard's, I'd learn later, leaned into the conversation uninvited and said, loud enough for the people near us to hear, "Word of advice, sweetheart. Gold diggers usually last about 3 years before the money gets boring. Just something to think about." Nathaniel was 15 feet away, laughing with his groomsmen, and didn't hear it. Or he did, and chose the easier silence. I still don't know which, and by the end of that night, I stopped caring which it was. I want you to understand, I had absorbed worse than this for over a year. I had built a callus over the part of me that used to flinch at things like this. But something about hearing it in front of 240 people, on a night that was supposed to be mine, cracked the callus open. I smiled at the man. I said, "That's an interesting theory," and I walked away toward the edge of the tent, out where the string lights thinned into darkness, and I took out my phone. My CFO, Daniel, had been trying to reach me for 20 minutes. There was a term sheet that needed my signature by midnight, a 9-figure acquisition, the kind that doesn't wait for anyone's engagement party, and the paperwork required me in New York, in person, notarized, before a deadline that Zurich's time zone had already made brutally tight. I answered. I said 4 words. "I'll be outside in 5 minutes." I didn't know, when I said it, that half the tent had gone quiet enough to hear me. I want to slow down here, because this is the part people always ask me about, and I understand why. I walked back toward the tent's opening to find my coat. Deborah intercepted me, confused, asking if everything was all right, and I said only that I had a work matter I needed to attend to. She laughed. Actually laughed, and said something to the effect of, "A work emergency at this hour? What is it? The coffee shop caught fire." I didn't answer that. I was already walking toward the parking area when the sound started. It began as a low rhythm in the sky, the kind of thing you feel in your chest before you consciously register it as sound. Guests near the edge of the tent looked up. Then more of them. Then all of them. A private helicopter cut across the tree line first, not mine, as it turned out, just my security lead's ride from the airfield, sent ahead to clear ground transport, and behind it, further out over the club's back 9, the unmistakable low approach of a jet coming down toward the small regional airport 6 minutes from the property. Nobody at that party knew whose it was. For about 90 seconds, that uncertainty was almost funny to watch. I saw at least 4 different guests turn to each other and murmur some version of "someone important must be flying in." Richard actually straightened his jacket, as if the plane might be for him. Then 3 black SUVs came up the club's private drive, headlights cutting across the tent, and stopped exactly where I was standing. My head of security, a broad, serious man named Elias who had worked personal protection for 2 governors before he worked for me, stepped out of the first vehicle, walked directly past Richard, past Deborah, past 240 stunned guests in cocktail attire, and stopped in front of me. He said, clearly, in the particular quiet way trained people speak when they know a room is listening, "Miss Hale, the aircraft is ready whenever you are. Zurich is holding the line for your signature. Miss Hale." Not Vivian. not Nathaniel's fiancée. Miss Hale, the way you address someone whose name is on the door. I have never, before or since, heard silence land on a room the way it landed on that tent. I wish I could tell you I'd planned that moment for dramatic effect. I hadn't. Daniel had simply done his job, Elias had simply done his, and the collision of my two lives happened because a jet doesn't care what night it lands on. But I won't pretend I didn't feel something, standing there, watching Deborah's champagne glass tilt dangerously in her hand as her mouth opened and nothing came out. I won't pretend some old, tired part of me didn't feel a flicker of vindication. Nathaniel pushed through the crowd first. Viv, what is this? What's going on? I looked at him, and for 1 second I almost softened it, almost made it small and manageable the way I'd been making myself small and manageable for 14 months. Then I thought about my father's hospital room, and I didn't. I run Hale Meridian Group, I said. I have for 6 years. I need to fly to New York tonight to sign an acquisition before a banking deadline. I'll explain everything when I land. Richard, to his credit, was the first to find actual words. Hale Meridian, he repeated, and I watched something behind his eyes do arithmetic very quickly. His firm had tried, and failed, 18 months earlier, to get a meeting with Hale Meridian's acquisitions team about a mid-sized logistics fund. He knew exactly what those 2 words meant. I watched the color leave his face in real time. Deborah found her voice last, and it came out thin. That's not possible. You don't even have a car. I have 4, I said. None of them park in your driveway. I didn't say it to be cruel. I said it because it was, after over a year, simply true, and true things had become a kind of relief to say out loud. I turned to Elias and told him I'd be 1 minute. Then I turned back to the tent, to Nathaniel standing frozen, to his mother gripping her husband's arm, to Caroline somewhere behind them with her hand over her mouth, to 240 guests who would talk about this night for years without ever quite agreeing on what they'd actually seen. I'll call you from the plane, I told Nathaniel, and I meant it kindly. Then I walked to the SUV, and Elias closed the door behind me, and the last thing I saw through the tinted window was Deborah Whitfield standing perfectly still under string lights, holding a champagne glass she'd forgotten was in her hand. The flight to Teterboro took 40 minutes. I signed the acquisition documents at 11:40, 4 minutes shy of a deadline I'd have paid dearly to miss. Over a video call with a notary in Zurich who had absolutely no idea she was witnessing the strangest night of my personal life alongside the most routine transaction of my professional one. Nathaniel called at midnight. I let it go once. He called again. I answered the second time somewhere over Pennsylvania. I need you to explain this to me, he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was smaller than I'd ever heard it, which somehow made everything worse. So I explained. I told him about my father, about Ohio, about the partner who forged the signatures, about the hospital room and the promise. I told him about 6 years of building something out of almost nothing, quietly, on purpose, without needing anyone's applause for it. I told him the truth was never a trap I'd set for his family. It was a mirror I'd simply stopped holding up for them and let them describe themselves in the dark instead. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said the thing that told me everything I still needed to know. I knew they treated you badly, he said. I always knew. I told myself it would get better once we were married, once they got used to you. I thought if I just waited it out, it would fix itself. You knew, I repeated. I didn't think it was that serious. Nathaniel, I said, a man told me at our own engagement party that gold diggers get boring after 3 years. You were 15 feet away. He didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one that would have helped him. The days after the party moved fast, the way things do once a secret this large finally gets loose in the world. Business press picked up the acquisition within 48 hours, and with it came the inevitable profile pieces. The ones that mentioned Hale Meridian's founder had been quietly engaged to a Whitfield of the Greenwich Whitfields. Deborah's social circle, The same women who had spent a year commenting on my thrift store cardigans apparently spent that week doing a different kind of arithmetic altogether. Caroline called me first, 3 days after the party, with an apology so smooth it sounded rehearsed, which I found out later from a cousin it was. Richard sent a card. Deborah invited me to lunch alone so we can start fresh, daughter to almost daughter. She used the word daughter for the first time in 14 months, exactly 4 days after learning what I was worth. I want to be honest about something. There was a version of me, in that first week, that wanted to accept all of it. Not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of exhaustion. It would have been so much easier to let them rewrite the last year into a misunderstanding everyone could move past. But I kept thinking about the salad fork, about the shopping bag of hand-me-downs, about a man at my own party joking about my expiration date while my fiancé laughed 15 feet away. None of that had happened because they didn't know who I was. It had happened because of who they were, and a bank balance doesn't change a person's character. It only changes how loudly they're willing to say it. I asked Nathaniel to meet me 2 weeks after the party at a small restaurant in the city, somewhere his mother had never set foot. He came looking tired, hopeful in a way that made this harder, not easier. "My family wants to make this right," he said. "They're ready to welcome you properly. My mother's already talking about redoing the wedding plans, bigger, better, whatever you want." "That's not what I want," I said. I never wanted a bigger party. I wanted to be treated like a person before anyone knew what I was worth. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. 100 times sooner." "You should have," I agreed. "But I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually sit with it before you answer." He nodded. "Would you still be standing here," I said, "if that plane had never landed?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out for a long moment. And in that silence, I already had my answer, the same way I'd had my answer, quietly, for over a year, every time he said, "That's enough," instead of "Stop." He didn't lie to me. I'll give him that much. He said, eventually, "I don't know. I want to say yes, but I don't know." "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 14 months, I told him, and I meant it as something close to a compliment, even though it ended us. I called off the engagement 3 days later. I sent Deborah a short, polite message thanking her for her hospitality over the past year and letting her know the wedding was no longer happening. I didn't send an explanation. I didn't need to give her one. The arithmetic she'd already done had done that work for me. People ask me sometimes if I regret hiding my life from them for so long. I don't, not really. I think if I'd told them from the start, they would have performed kindness instead of revealing themselves. I would have spent a year wondering which parts of their warmth were real and which were arithmetic. Instead, I got the truth, delivered without any performance at all, and the truth is always cheaper in the long run, even when it costs you something in the moment. I flew back to Ohio that winter, alone, and visited my father's grave for the first time in 2 years. I stood there for a long time in the cold, and I told him, out loud, that I'd kept the promise. That I'd let people show me who they were before I ever handed them a reason to be kind to me. That it had cost me a fiancé and over a year of quiet humiliation, but that I'd learned something in the process that no amount of money could have taught me faster. I learned that the people who need your bank account to determine your worth were never actually measuring you at all. They were measuring themselves and finding a comfortable way to feel superior while they did it. I don't know what happened to Nathaniel after that winter. I heard, secondhand, that he left his family's firm about a year later to start something of his own, something small, something that had nothing to do with his father's name. Maybe that plane taught him something too. I hope it did. I don't wish him anything but good things. I just couldn't build a life with someone who needed proof before he'd defend me. If you're watching this and you've ever sat quietly at a table while someone decided your worth for you, I want you to hear the only thing I know for certain: 6 years and $1 billion company and 1 broken engagement later. The people who measure your worth by your bank account will never deserve your loyalty. Real wealth isn't what you own. It's knowing your value before anyone else ever gets the chance to tell you otherwise. My name is Vivian Hale. And I stopped waiting for permission to be exactly who I already was.